Everyone hear me? Is my mic working? Oh, it is. Cool. We might as well get started. We're a few minutes early, but screw it. Okie dokie. So basically, I should start with a caveat here. I only really got accepted to do this presentation a week after the slides were due to be submitted. So I basically had to put all my slides together in a day and check them in type thing. So it might be a little bit bare. That's okay, because you just focus on me rather than what's going on the screen. So the title of the presentation is Business Proof of Concepts on Windows 8. And we'll start with a bit of an introduction. My name is Christopher Pritchard. I'm a solutions architect at Provoke Solutions Wellington. I've been in the industry for about 10 years, been working for Provoke for about 6. Specialities have been in web development, which is pretty much what we do in Wellington, although we do a bit of everything, primarily in the Microsoft stack. And my speciality for a long time has been SharePoint, but I've always tried to keep my fingers in all the pies. So I've done a lot of app development as we moved into the WinPhone space, a bit of Windows 8 shenanigans. As a service company, we work for a number of clients who come to us asking for a solution to something. And a lot of that in recent years has been mobile solutions. And from that, this talk has evolved. The intended audience for this is people who are developing either Windows 8 apps or more accurately, I guess it's sort of in the context of my role as an architect. So the way this presentation started was we had a company who wanted to build a tablet app for something they were doing, government related. And they knew they wanted to develop it for the iPad because most of the people had iPads. So it was like, okay, fair enough, that's good value. They followed an approach because they knew they wanted to go for Android and Windows 8 down the line. And they decided to buy some software which cost about 300 grand, which would mean that they would only have to develop it once and then deploy it automatically to all the other platforms through the auto generation of code, which is obviously a horrible idea. So we had Microsoft contacted us, and then we went there to chat to them, and I gave a meeting to them where I explained that I thought this was bad for a number of reasons, and ultimately suggested that they start on Windows 8. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring this up here is that this presentation isn't about telling you guys or telling the people that you might end up talking to that you should develop solely for Windows 8 and discard the other platforms. It's merely suggesting that in the context of a proof of concept, which is what this is all about, you should do Windows 8 first. Now, it is subjective, very subjective, based on my personal beliefs, which you may very well choose to disagree with. But the fact that I have these beliefs and the explanations I used with them for the client, I think are important for other people to have, so that if you're in a similar situation, you either use the same ones, or if you wanted to argue completely in the other direction and dismiss me, it's important to know what my arguments were so you can argue against them. So, caveat, subjectives, nonsense. Right. So this is the key message of my presentation, that when putting together a business proof of concept, an application designed to prove whether or not the business actually needs the app or wants to subjectively design one, they should do it on Windows 8 as the first platform. Now, what I'm going to do is divide my argument here into 3 separate sections. The first section is native versus non-native. So obviously in any sort of development, in this sort of context, is assuming that it's native developed. If you're going to do web developed applications and then just deploy via a wrapper or a shim, then the whole discussion goes out the window. So start by saying native versus non-native. The next aspect is why Windows 8, in my opinion, is faster than the other platforms for development and why you would choose to pick it first as opposed to going through the iPad or Android route. And the third section is talking about the market, which is not directly suggestive of the key point, but has an important consideration in it because it's content to answer the first question you'll get from anyone that is approaching this space. Namely, why would they develop for the smallest of the 3 markets? All right, so I've color-coded them. I've decided to discard imagery to sort of hammer the point, at least on these heading slides. And we'll start with native versus non-native. Right, and in order for you to follow through this section, it's important why, so if we keep going back to the proof of concepts are about, they have defined aspects to them, defined objectives. One of the ones is that it needs to be developed very, very quickly, and the second one, it needs to demonstrate the capabilities of the platform. There's no point developing a tablet app if you're not going to do something tablet-related. So with those two things in mind, rapid prototyping and demonstration capabilities, that is sort of the overall thing you should keep in the back of the mind as we proceed through this section. For this section, what I'll do is I'll go through 3 separate approaches, including the ones that I obviously disagree with, which I'll start with first, and explain what they are. This is my spiffy Visio stuff, where I had to start learning in great depth when I switched from a developer to an architect. All right, web multi-platform non-native. So this is a common concept that you hear a lot in the industry, where people choose to develop once. They build like a web application, a website, what have you, in HTML or in MVC or whatever you want to do, and then they deploy it to a web server host, and then they read it on the tablets, and that sort of fakes the tablet experience. Or they might wrap it with a tablet native app that just opens up a web browser and opens up the web application. Now, this has a number of advantages, and this is one of the big controversial arguments of this sort of type tablet development. The advantages you have is that you only need to develop the app once, which is obviously quite useful. You can leverage a lot of the existing skills in your organization. I believe these days that web development is slightly more popular than native development. Not popular, there's just more developers in that space. Not to mention the fact that the technology you choose to build your web application has got nothing to do with where you actually deploy it. So you build a web application in MVC, and you can read it easily enough on an iPad or Android or whatever you want to do. And that's the other advantages as well. Like if you're doing a prototype for a business audience and you want to show them something, run them through it, want them to play with it, you can do it without needing to actually have a device handy, which is quite useful. Eventually you will need a device, but that's definitely an advantage early on if you just want to whip something out in the afternoon. The cons, of course, is that you have a web dependency. Now, it's quite surprising that when you build a proof of concept, a lot of the situations that you'll end up being in when you're demonstrating it, you don't actually have an internet connection. It seems reasonably prevalent that you've got internet connections everywhere, but when you're demonstrating proof of concepts, you tend to be doing them at client sites or in client buildings, and clients don't always want to give you unfettered access to their network to connect to the internet. So you might be in a situation a lot of time where you don't actually have an internet connection. And of course, if you did carry this through to the eventual conclusion and actually take your prototype and turn it into a finished app, not everyone wants to have apps on their devices which need an internet connection constantly, especially when you're in a situation like this and the internet access might not necessarily be as robust as it might otherwise be. The other con you have here is that you need to have styling per platform. I'll go into this a little bit more when I go into the development section, but basically platforms aren't the same. It doesn't matter who you go to. If you go into the Apple Development Center, or you go to Android, one of their many sites, or you go to the Microsoft MSDN Hub, they'll all tell you that you don't try and develop one app that fits everything, because the different apps have different styles to them. They're all tablet devices, but people use their tablets differently. And this presentation, even though it's targeted primarily at Windows 8, it also applies just as validly to phone stuff, so Windows Phone versus iPhone or an Android. So in those ones, they also advise you you have to actually tailor your apps for the different platforms. They have different UI styles, they fit differently, even different arrangements. So if you're building a web platform, then you end up spending a lot of time doing CSS shenanigans and JavaScript DOM manipulation to make your stuff work appropriately for each tablet, or look appropriately for each tablet anyway. And the final point, which is a bit hit and miss, is that, it's a bit hit and miss, is that you can't really leverage the native aspects of the platform. You can leverage a lot of them. So you normally get geolocation through web development. You get bits and pieces, swipe and touch support. That all works quite well for a website. But there's always crazy magic that you can't do because it's HTML and it's not designed for that platform. If you want to use those advanced functionality, you need to leverage native functionality. You need to have a native app. So that's a con. Performance was the other one I listed here, but I feel that with modern devices, performance isn't as much of an issue as it used to be. Internet Explorer 11 on Windows 8.1 is easily one of the fastest JavaScript renderers out there. So if you're building your app in JavaScript, you won't notice a substantial difference between that and C#. So performance is a con for building a web multi-platform non-native that you deploy, but it's not necessarily a crippling one. I might just start my timer 10 minutes late. There we go. Cool, so with that in mind, I'll just move on to the second of my 3 principles here, which is that you build code once, convert to multiple. So my initial example was this unnamed government department that bought this product for 250 odd K from some vendor in the States, which they allowed them to code it once using, I think it was C++. and then it would auto-generate the code for the other platforms. Now, my background is a senior developer, so I don't like the idea of auto-generated code, and I can't imagine it would have been particularly performant in this case. So the cons are kind of obvious, but I'll deliver a few of them anyway. One of the ones being that these platforms all update on a regular basis at different schedules, and if you buy a program like this, then you're stuck with what it chooses to do and updating that. I would imagine it would generate actual development projects for each native platform, and then you'd spend a lot of time maintaining it. So it's kind of an example of trying to solve the wrong problem. They build this approach so that you don't have to have a development team for each thing. You can have one development team that develops once and then gets deployed natively. It's just too automagical for me, and I imagine it's too automagical in practice. So yeah, so that's definitely solving the wrong problem. That's basically all I have to say about that. Yeah, I don't know. I've never actually used the software, but I thought it was a disaster and advised them appropriately. Now, this is the approach that I'm advocating, which can be a tough sell for a business person. You're saying basically you've got 3 different platforms that you might want to develop for. Get 3 different teams. Have a team that's targeted towards Windows 8, a team that's targeted towards Android, and a team targeted towards OS X. There's a slight flaw in that presentation. That question mark should be a star. I do actually know that what devices you can code Android on, but there's more than one. Now, so you need to have multiple developers or one especially skilled developer who can develop on more than one platform. But anyone who has had some development experience in the past, and imagine if you are in charge of developers, they'll tell you the same thing. When they only have to consider one platform at a time, it's a simpler job for them. It doesn't matter how difficult each individual platform happens to be. So in my personal experience, I find developing in Objective-C quite difficult compared to C#. But if I was coding in an Objective-C, it would be a simpler problem than trying to code for both. This sort of is analogous, if you're in the web development world, to the problem we have to deal with constantly, which has become a lot easier in recent years, which is developing for more than one browser. If you only ever have to develop for one browser, which is very convenient when you work in the government world because they only ever have one, it tends to be a relatively simple issue. You don't have to deal with problems. So the business guy will come out and they'll say that this is going to be expensive. I don't want to hire these bunch of developers. I suggest to them you're only going to have one team at a time, and then you'll hire other teams once you've proved your concept. You don't need to do it all at once, which is, again, coming back to the primary principle of this presentation, which is that you start with Windows 8 and then move to the others. And because there's smaller teams working on a smaller scope, if you will, then the actual total development cost will be lower. Obviously, that tends to resonate quite strongly with business people. All right, so that was the first section all covered, which is basically that central premise, that native is better than non-native. Once that's established, then we can move into the other sections about why native development on the Windows 8 device is faster than the others. Now, this entire section's in spiffy orange, and again, I'll start by explaining the principles of a proof of concept that I believe this section reinforces. That is that a proof of concept needs to be developed quickly. It needs to be indicative enough of the final completed product that actually serves its function as a proof of concept. If your proof of concept doesn't resemble the final product at all, there's no point you building it because it doesn't actually prove anything. And this is sort of a personal thing, since I'm a solutions architect and I have to consider resources all the time, is that you want to try and have your proof of concepts not require the best developer on your team, because developers are expensive, and senior developers especially so. So you want your platform to be simple enough that you can throw either a graduate developer at it or intermediate. You don't want to have to enlist a massive team and spend 3 weeks doing it. If someone can knock out your app in the course of a week by themselves, that's a big money saver. So anything that the platform does to support that is useful. So again, those are the 3 concepts that I'm illustrating for the 3 sort of background objectives of this, that hopefully these following slides will illustrate why Windows 8 has an advantage in that section. Now, you see I mentioned C# and XAML as opposed to WinJS and HTML. Obviously, it's quite well known, hopefully, to all of you that on Windows 8 you have 2 approaches you can follow. You can either follow the C# XAML route and that entire ecosystem with WPF, Silverlight, WinPhone, all that, or you can use this newfangled WinJS stuff. Now, I have written quite a bit with both. I actually wrote a bunch of apps to get these screenshots, which took me about an hour to put together. I was reasonably proud of it. And both of those different technologies, and my argument here is very controversial and very subjective, so don't hit me up on this, is that I prefer C# XAML. And the reason why I prefer that is because I believe C# is a superior language for rapid development. If you want to code something quickly, C# with the big .NET shenanigans around it is faster to do, to work with than JavaScript. Not just because of the superiority of the language, which is also very subjective, because obviously there's the asynchronous capabilities of JavaScript are very strong, and the number of JavaScript stuff I've written means I have a healthy respect for that language, but also because of the tooling. Even with ReSharper and other stuff, the tooling for C# is just better than what you get for JavaScript right now. So for rapid development, it's good. Regarding XAML versus HTML, that's a much more complicated question. XAML is obviously, controversial. Some people hate it, some people love it. I hated it and I loved it. I've got a huge experience with HTML, so I kind of tried to code it like HTML, and that was a bit of a disaster. But the data binding sort of fits the app model better. So if you're building a native application, XAML kind of works well on that sense. And saying that, WinJS, I quite like it. I think they've done a really good job of building a Microsoft single-page application. But I think, I don't know. I still code faster in HTML and CSS than I do in XAML, but it's a very close call these days. They've done so much of both. Although in saying that, when I built these two demos, I built the HTML one in half the time. But that was mainly because it was trivial. If it had been larger, then I think XAML would have been much more advantageous. So it's kind of like that mixed light and dark world. You get a faster programming language in C#, and you get a slower rendering engine in XAML. But I'll proceed with the assumption that my argument has convinced you, and C# XAML is the correct way forward. Was there any other points I wanted to bring up in this space? No. Okay. Okay, cool. So the second aspect to this would be going back on the rapid developer context and the idea of using limited resources, is that you might not necessarily want to leverage a designer user experience specialist. Now, Provoke Solutions, that's one of our specialities, not leveraging. Our speciality is having design user experience specialists, but that's a secondary resource that you might not necessarily want to have. You want a developer to whip something up that they can show a business person, and maybe limit the engagement of serious styling to cater an app for a given perspective until after the proof of concept is going into its second phase. Now, to this sense, developers don't tend to be all that good at UX styles. I mean, not as bad as we used to be. We've got all the acknowledgement of, we know we're not engineers, we've got to keep the buttons down. Web developers, a web developer knows that they have to keep the styling simpler. But things like, grid layouts and a nice sort of unified text and imagery and structure of the engine is quite important. And of course, Microsoft, since the beginning with, I think WinFoam was when they really started pushing this, they've come up with that unified style and come up with all these guidelines, Metro or whatever it's called now, and they pushed that out. But then they baked it into the platform as well. So I've done a bit of work on the other platforms, iPad and Android, and they have the same thing. But at least on the Android, it's opt-in rather than opt-out. With Windows 8, it's very much opt-out, so you start with it all baked in, and then you have to work sometimes quite hard to get out of that mode. So, for example, these magical demos that I whipped up in about 10 minutes, all that styling just came out of the box, and this also demonstrates a couple of the structures that come out of there. Now, it's nothing particularly special in these images. I mean, anyone who's worked with any of these technologies will know this is probably the first thing you see. But nevertheless, you could see if you're a business user, that look, they kind of want to see that. If they've got their branding slapped up in the corner there, they're sort of half sold already, because now they have a nice ergonomic experience that kind of fits well with the tablet. And on top of that, if you did want to go further and you want your developer to have some speciality on that, or if you do want to engage a user experience specialist and have them go look at stuff, the documentation on stuff is immense, and it's quite justified. It's not a 400-page document, it's a 5-page document that starts with theory and then completely convinces you by the end of it, and then you've got all the other resources to go on from there. So I was following the 8.1 presentation that was in here earlier, and they've added more functionality in there, like day pickers, which is was hard to do unaccountably. So, yeah, with luck, that's what it kind of makes it that you really just have to select your assets and pretty it up a little bit, and all of a sudden you've got this nice sort of good-looking application with multiple pages and shift between the two that your developer just put together themselves. One resource, rapid development. So again, that fits into that general concept of minimizing cost, getting an app out there, and having people support it. So to conclude this section, with my little submission process there. The other thing is, and going back to the idea of not having a senior resource and having people scale up rapidly, it's all about having a good, strong community. And I feel like that Microsoft are quite aware that they're the underdog in this space. So they have made extensive effort to make it as easy as possible. They've got the most extensive usage supply of tutorials I've ever seen on the platform. Usually when the platform comes out, they have 30 different apps demonstrating everything you can do with it the next day. The one for Windows 8 is just like the one for WinPhone, is very extensive and is great. On top of that, so assuming you do go with the C# XAML approach, the engine family, I'm not sure what you call it since every individual version of it has been just subtly different. That sort of family has been going along for a long time, ever since Silverlight came out. So there are platforms that build on top of it. Specifically, the one that I've used most of all is Caliban Micro. I know some of you probably know what that is. Made by Rob Eisenberg. It's been going for a number of years and is a MVVM framework that builds on top of the native capabilities of XAML. And I have found that for any non-trivial application, that can drastically reduce the amount of time it takes you to do it. With every application I build for myself personally, which there have been half a dozen or so, and every one I've built for Provoke solutions, I've always used Caliban Micro. And now that I'm an architect, I just tell my developers to do that as well. So quite useful platform. Was there anything else I wanted to say on that? Oh yeah, the community is also pretty good out there. I'm not sure how I would characterize it without directly criticizing the competitors to this platform, but it is full of experts that don't tend to get sort of angry about it. You ask questions, you get answers. Caliban Micro is a good example. If you ask him anything on his forums, he's probably the one who's going to answer before anyone else. It's a very sort of professional feeling community, which I like, and it's very big because all these people are either enthusiasts, but most often are not corporate developers, and corporate developers just want to get things done correctly, and so they don't have to maintain it in a year. So it sort of fosters a nice sort of ecosystem, which I'm quite a fan of. I will point out one final thing. So this presentation is about tablet development, not specifically Windows 8 development, but tangentially Windows 8 development, since that's the platform that we're arguing about. And Windows 8 isn't just a tablet operating system, obviously. It's also a desktop operating system. It's usually the operating system you're using while you're developing the app for the tablet. And so as a result, you don't have to dick around with plugging in devices and testing stuff. You get the emulator, which is very useful. A colleague of mine, Jacques, used it to good effect when he was demonstrating his SharePoint device channels. He just whipped up the emulator for Windows 8 development and then tested out his SharePoint app on the emulator. The way that works is actually kind of weird, actually. It logs into your own PC, so you got access to everything on your machine through the emulator. So it's quite useful from that perspective. And of course, if you don't want to use the emulator, you just flip it up on the main screen, which is also quite useful, since anything you develop for a tablet running Windows 8, you're also developing for every PC in the world who's running Windows 8. So having the ability to test it in those two different modes is quite useful. All right, so that kind of concludes the development section. Now, what I wanted to push there was that it is very easy and very quick, and there's a lot of support in that area. Now, I'm not saying that this is especially unique. The other platforms have this as well. What I will say is I believe that C# is a faster development platform than Objective-C and the others. And I think that's more just sort of the characteristic of the language. So .NET is obviously, I don't know what the phrase is, I guess bottom heavy. It's got the .NET library, which is this massive chunk of functionality that you get whether you want it or not, that you can leverage in all your platforms. One of the chief examples I know of is that we, a few years ago, were developing a WinPhone app for a company, and they'd also contracted another team to build the iPhone app. And this was traveling sensitive data through a web service. And on C# it was 2 lines of code because it's just SHA encryption. It comes directly out of the .NET framework. The iPhone developers they had 3 pages worth of code to do that, and they couldn't get it working, putting me in the uncomfortable situation where I had to debug their code, slightly offset by the fact that I also wrote the web service, so I was trying to fix my problem, but from the other end. But it was quick and it was fast, and we've got a couple of lines. It's easy to do. So that's. I imagine a number of you guys saw the TechEd conference yesterday with Phil Kirkland and et al. And they were talking about encryption there. And so it's got quite a good encryption framework built in, and lots of other stuff into it as well. So that's where the .NET runtime really supports this rapid development model. Whether or not down the line the other frameworks have advantages isn't the point of this discussion. It's just about developing quickly so that you can test the concept and then continue. Questions at the end? Cool. Market and prototype support. So this is the final section we'll go over. Now, this is tangentially related to the discussion because we're talking about proof of concepts. I mean, you could build a proof of concept and then prove it to your business users, and they could say, cool, let's build it on an iPad, and then throw your proof of concept away. No problem with that. It depends on what the target market is. But I feel that this is important because the first question they'll ask you when you try and promote this, or the first question you will have to answer yourselves when you actually think about this, is why would I develop for the smallest of the 3 platforms? So the market and its support for prototypes is significant. All right, so the 3 concepts I'll cover in this section is the size of the market, the ease of the submission process, and projections about the future. And this is all pretty subjective. I mean, it may or may not be true. So this slide I probably shouldn't have put together, but it basically covers what the rough statistics are. I don't want to go too heavy on statistics because people just lie with statistics, which is why I haven't written these statistics up here, and this is why I'm going to read them out to you. So right now, Windows 8 is in the minority. It has about 5 to 10% of the entire worldwide market. Now, obviously, 10% of all operating systems is significant, but that's not much compared to the others. Of course, its biggest competitor is Windows 7, sitting on 47%. It's completely eclipsed Vista, which is down to 5, and I think XP is like at 40 or something stupid. So yeah, it's quite significant. These stats are coming from a company called Net Application Statistics via Wikipedia. So yeah, so there's a few things why this is quite a complicated aspect to it. Because we're talking about tablet devices, but again, going back to the earlier point, Windows 8 isn't just a tablet platform, it's also a desktop platform. Despite all the noise out there and whatever competitors the 4 major competitors are doing in their wars, Windows as an operating system is still 90% of the global desktop market. XP is nearing the end of its lifetime. No, it's met the end of its lifetime, according to Microsoft. So all the people who don't want to move off it are soon not going to have much of a choice. In theory, they'll go from that to the latest operating system and not from that to Windows 7. But even then, Windows 7 people who have adopted that are more sort of likely to upgrade. So I feel that the market for Windows 8 is going to develop exceptionally quickly and will get very, very big very, very quickly. So your market is expanding dramatically. It's already surpassed the sales of Vista and 7, so that's quite useful. So the reason why this is relevant back to the proof of concept stuff is first you can argue that, okay, so it's small, but it's not necessarily going to remain small. Second is proof of concepts usually don't get rebuilt after they're done. Once you finish your proof of concept, then once your business guy goes in there and gives it a tick, you then take that and you finish it and then you publish it. So you don't throw it away and start again. If you have a proof of concept that you developed on this platform initially just to sort of sell stuff, explore the concept, find a way what you want to add, what you want to remove, at the end of it now you've got something that you can just throw into the market. And so even if you think your primary customer is the iPad or the Android, you've still got this, we've still got this corner of the market covered. And then assuming if the companies finish their war and Microsoft might end up on top, then all of a sudden you've got the bigger chunk of the market for almost no effort. So that's quite a useful consideration, and business people like thinking about the future. So the second aspect that you might cover, it goes further back to the development stuff, is the submission process for apps is an important consideration, I'd say. My experience with the iPhone App Store has not been positive regarding getting apps approved, more because they're a little bit more ambiguous about their rule sets and can choose to interpret them however which way. And of course they try to balance their market a little bit, which causes problems. The Android store is much easier, very, very easy, much easier than Windows even, but that is offset by the fact you have to develop for every platform in the world. So you know, there's gains and losses in those two. But so what I'm going to talk about here is the Windows one, which is actually pretty good. Now, I'll walk through the process, which is pretty straightforward. You do need an account to develop apps for Windows 8. That's something that Android does better because it doesn't need one for that. You need to have at least in order to publish it, you need a developer app, an app account, which is about $100 a year in New Zealand, or free if you follow one of their sweepstakes when they try to increase the developer pool. But you can have a trial account, well, not a trial account, a developer-only account when you are just developing, and that costs nothing. But you need to have an account, because the next step is you reserve the name of your app, which makes sure that you haven't called it something else in the store. And then the strength of it, which I find is probably what's completely sold me on it right now, is recently they released so basically what they do when you submit your app is they run it through these programs that go through and check that your app is not violating any of the 200-odd rules that they want you not to violate, which are really, really common sense rules, like don't use default images, don't have it crash to this, don't make it kill other apps, blah, blah. A lot of that's programmatic. And then after that, they go through the step where they validate that you're not throwing pornography up there or something like that. So there's two steps there. One which is completely automated, and one which is very subjective based on their reviewing team. The reviewing team is pretty good as long as you're not doing something that brings the platform into disrepute. They usually don't care. So I've never had an app get dismissed based on content grounds. It's always been dismissed based on technical grounds. And then they had the good grace to actually give you the app when you get the Windows 8 SDK or install Visual Studio 2013. They give you the validation kit and you install it on your own PC. And it takes about 5 minutes to run through those checks. So now it makes you do that before you try and submit it. So you already know whether or not your app's going to fail their technology restraints before you even goes through the submission process, which is a massive gain. You can run through 6 or 7 cycles trying to correct your little problems, some of which can be a little bit niggling. And once it finishes its little check, which takes 5 minutes, and you see a little app bouncing up and bouncing down and bouncing up and bouncing down on your screen as it opens it and tries to kill it to find a problem with it. It comes up with this HTML report, which is about 6 pages long, and it says pass, 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 pass all the way down the end, and exactly what you passed and why you're passing it. And I was actually pretty impressed by what it fails on. So this is an example from the app I did punch up for this test, a little base64 encoder, and it failed because I'd forgotten to replace the default images that come with the template. So it worked out that the byte signatures of those were identical and said, you've got to update those before you get failed in the store. So went off and fixed that, and I was away laughing. So I find that a very clean submission process, especially since once you've done all that, you've uploaded your thing, you've passed your little validation tests, you can bounce up to the store, and it usually takes 24 hours for it to come back and say whether or not you're not going to be in the marketplace. So 24 hours is a big cut down from 3 or 4 weeks, which I experienced on the iPad store. It's even a big cut down from the old submission process on Windows 7, which used to take Windows Phone 7, which used to take about a week. So I like that they've cut that barrier down because no one wants to screw around with the actual deployment strategy that's going through. And they've obviously made efforts to reduce that. Now, it's not perfect. There's one thing that I really like on the Win phone, which we don't have on the Windows 8 device, which is the prototype program, beta program rather, which would be very useful for this talk since this talk's all about betas. And the way that works is that on the Windows Phone 8 and Windows Phone 7.8 and Windows Phone 7.1 and Windows Phone 7, you can sit there and say, I would like to participate in a beta program, and then you say, these are the people I'd like to see it, and you just list Microsoft accounts, or people's accounts that also happen to be Microsoft accounts. So we used it for a client whose domain was on ADFS, so all their company accounts were also Microsoft accounts. We just list them there, and then this is all pre-validation, so it doesn't have to go through the app certification, and it just sends a copy to them through the marketplace, so they can download it on whatever device they have. And that was really, really cool, because they could be in different places. In this case, we were developing for Wellington, and they were in Auckland, and they could just download it straight from the store, and only they could see it, which means that your proof of concept can be bounced to business people around the world, and that's pretty useful. Now, the Windows 8 store doesn't have that, which was something I was quite disappointed to discover, given that the stores themselves are virtually identical in every other way. Now, I was trying to work out why they didn't do it. I got a feeling that it will be something coming, but I also think that there might be a good justification for it. Basically, Windows devices are all locked down. They don't want you screwing around with putting apps up. They don't really care if you do, but so people can jailbreak their phones and install things if they really want to do that. But principally, they try to put barriers in place because they don't want to harm the perception of the phone. Windows 8, unless you're running on an RT, and even then it's not set in stone, they really don't care if you dick with it. It's your PC, basically. It's your operating system. So in that sense, putting an app that someone's developed for the Metro thing on your platform is it's reasonably easy if you have a little technical know-how. I think they call it side loading. I don't know, I did it once. It was pretty easy. The other way that we do it, we've done it a lot for Provoke, is that we install the remote debugging tools on someone's thing, and then we just deploy directly to their tablet or device, and all you have to have is an interconnection, and that works pretty well. Although the disadvantage of that is that you need to actually sign in with a valid account on their machine for the tools. It does provide a good way to get rapid deployment on a real-world device if that floats your boat. Yeah, I think the only major risk with that is that it requires you to have your development machines directly connected to the destination device by a direct access connection, which is not always guaranteed because it tends to be behind your domain network, and unlocking devices can be problematic. So, yeah, that kind of covers the market and submission process aspects of the whole thing. Got no idea how well I'm doing for time. I suspect I might have gone a little bit quicker than I was supposed to be going. But anyway, summary. So basically what I've covered over so far is that native applications are superior to non-native, or at least I believe so. So when you're advocating something to a client, you want to advocate speed and rapid development, and a native application will give you that advantage. Whether or not you choose to follow that model when you end up in production, that's largely up to you. I've also covered that the Windows 8 development platform and Windows Phone development platform has some significant advantages, or at least powerful tools that are available to you in order to do that development rapidly, which fits back into the generic model that you want to develop quickly without, and in a short time frame, with perhaps low-skilled developers. Whether or not you choose to use low-skilled developers is up to you, but by using low-skilled developers, you can bring the cost down even further, and you're not going to spend a month developing the app. You can develop it relatively quickly in that space. And the final point I covered is that even though the question which highlights the need for meetings like this altogether is that Windows 8 is not superior in the market when it comes to tablet development, it's third. That might not necessarily change, or that might change in the short term. And even if it doesn't change, it's still a market. So 10% of the browser share is a significant amount of the browser share. You know, I'm not going to pull a number out of, but it could be a couple of million or whatever that is. So if you've got an app that sits in that space, why not? There's no reason not to do it. It's much harder to make the argument that I've developed and spent, you know, $500,000 building these elaborate tablet apps for the primary markets, and now you want me to spend the same amount of money for just 10%. You start with the 10%, that's not less of a problem. So, yeah, that's kind of the gist of my discussion. I hope this all sort of has worked together to illustrate the key point that I was trying to deliver, which is that if you're going to build a proof of concept for a tablet device, then I think Windows 8 is a good platform to start with, rather than going for the difficult ones first. As a caveat to this, I don't know how many of you guys read Hacker News. I follow it along. It's quite a useful sort of discussion. You do, yeah. But there was a recent article that completely reinforces this entire thing, which is quite useful since it was just before I was going to give the presentation. But it was saying that people should develop an Android before they develop an iPhone for basically the same reasons. The guy didn't even consider Windows, but that's all right. It's Hacker News. So, yeah, that kind of covers it up. Related content. My presentation's reasonably late in this conference, so a lot of the ones are already around. This one's coming up, which looks relatively appropriate, but I think the one next in this room, Fluid and Fast Windows 8 applications, is actually quite appropriate. So if you just wanted to float around, maybe pop out to rescan, that would be quite useful for you. There is a certification for Windows Store apps. Windows Store apps, and this kind of helps underline my point, are so easy to develop. That's actually a really easy certification to grab. It's not like SharePoint development or anything like that. It's quite simple. And you can find me later. I'll be floating around. I'm available at provoke.co.nz with that address. We've got an office in Auckland, we've got an office in Wellington, we've got an office in Seattle, we've got an office in Manila, and we've got an office in Singapore. So you can always track us down somewhere. And yeah, rate and review and give me good points and win awards. Any questions? Mr. Last, is it?
Yes, that's right, Chris. So obviously before you go on about using junior developers or grads to quickly spin out your rapid prototypes and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And you prefer coding in C# and Xamarin. What do you tend to steer them towards to help get those out quickly?
Depends on the developer. So I think Microsoft, in a sense, promoted the Windows WinJS stuff because for a few reasons. One, they've hopped fully on the HTML5 bandwagon, and two, they want to poach developers from other platforms. And HTML is kind of like HTML and JavaScript is the language of everyone. Everyone needs to know some of it, so it's quite an advantage for people picking that up. Unfortunately, I find that JavaScript is a language which is very easy to pick up and very, very easy to break unless you do a lot of work trying to become very good at it. I can't remember what's his name, Crocker or something. He wrote a really, really good book about it. The guy who wrote JSLint. So there's a lot of advanced JavaScript techniques in there, and the way you get it. That guy, yeah. And I like his presentation, and I like his book. And it's a really good guide for getting really good at JavaScript, even though it emphasizes the fact that you should not use 90% of that language because it's got problems with it. So I don't find grads tend to be expert JavaScript people. I don't find many senior developers who tend to be expert JavaScript people. But I find lots of people who know enough about C# to be dangerous and not to cause too many problems. So I generally push them in that direction. The only problem with that, of course, is XAML, because XAML has the same problem as JavaScript does. People do JavaScript wrong because they start with C-based languages and try to code JavaScript like C-based languages. People do XAML wrong because they start with HTML and they try to code XAML like HTML. So you just have to guide them and scream at them until they get things done. Does that answer your question? Anyone else? Nope. Okay, thank you very much.